Secretary General, thank you very much for this opportunity. Good to see you on TV Rain again. First of all, I would like to bring your statement about the 98% of the support weaponry delivered to Ukraine you have mentioned recently. What do you mean by that exactly, considering the fact that Kiev is asking for fighter jets and long-range systems? How should we understand this statement?
Also, I will answer that question in just a moment, but let me first say that it's great to be back and to see you, Ekaterina, and also let me praise what you do. Independent media is extremely important, especially in the midst of a war as we face in Ukraine now. So your reporting is something which we should all value, and I value very much. Then on your question, that was a reference to a specific target when it comes to 9 brigades which are trained outside Ukraine. They are now more or less fully equipped. But of course there's a constant need for more and even more equipment, ammunition, supplies, partly to sustain all the weapon systems which are already in Ukraine. They need ammunition, spare parts, maintenance, but also, of course, to add more systems. And therefore, I also welcome the recent announcements to not only provide main battle tanks, but also to provide now long-range cruise missiles, as the United Kingdom just announced this week or a few days ago, because Ukraine needs more weapons, more ammunition to be able to defend against President Putin's aggression against Ukraine.
And what about the fighter jets?
Well, what we have seen over time is that the support from NATO allies has been unprecedented. It started with light anti-tank weapons, the javelins and something called the NLAWs. Then the focus was on artillery, then on air defense, also more advanced air defense, Patriot batteries. And over the last months, allies have stepped up significantly when it comes to armored vehicles, battle tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and now most recently also cruise missiles from the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom and France have announced that they will start training of pilots. So this is the type of support has evolved. There are constant consultations among allies. But in addition to discussing new systems, I think it's extremely important to ensure that all the systems which are already in Ukraine get all the supplies they need to be fully functional, not least ammunition, so we can use all the systems which are already in Ukraine.
Secretary General, would you agree with the conclusion that the upcoming foreseeable counteroffensive would have just one chance of efficiency?
I think what we have seen over the last year or 15 months since since President Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine is that President Putin made a big strategic mistake. Because when he invaded Ukraine, which was a war by choice, he thought that he was going to take control over Ukraine within days. Now the war has lasted for 15 months, and the Ukrainians have been able to retake territory in the north around Kiev, then in the east around Kharkiv, and then in the south around Kherson. It's for the Ukrainians to make operational decisions. We are ready to support them in retaking territory. Whether this will be one big offensive or several offensives, how they will organize it, the timetable, that's not for NATO and NATO allies to decide. It's for Ukrainians to decide. Our responsibility is to support Ukraine for as long as it takes. And that was the second big strategic mistake President Putin made, and that was to underestimate NATO and NATO allies in our unity, in our resolve to support Ukraine, and we will continue to support Ukraine for as long as it takes.
As long as it takes, you and other officials keep on repeating this phrase, but there are so many questions about that. So if this counteroffensive is not as effective as it's supposed to be. Will you keep on supporting Ukraine?
Yes, we will keep on supporting Ukraine because we have made it absolutely clear again and again in NATO, NATO partners, allies, in the US-led Rammstein group that coordinated the military support, that we need to be there for as long as necessary. And this has been reiterated by many heads of state and government just recently, and I expect also that when we have the Vilnius summit in July, the NATO summit in July in Vilnius, the main message from that meeting with all the 31 heads of state and government from NATO allied countries will be that we will support Ukraine. Also, I also expect new announcements of additional support. Because it will be a tragedy for Ukraine if President Putin wins, but it also will be dangerous for all of us, because then it will demonstrate for other authoritarian leaders and for President Putin that when they use military force, when they violate international law, they get what they want. And we have to remember what this is. This is a war of aggression by choice by President Putin. No one attacked Russia. Ukraine was not a threat to Russia, but President Putin has this idea that he wants to control neighbors, and therefore he invaded a sovereign, independent nation, Ukraine, and Russia is paying a very high price. It leads to isolation of Russia. The empowerment of Russia becomes more, the people of Russia becomes poorer, and we see how Russian young men are used as cannon fodder for Putin's war of aggression. So it's in no one's interest that this war continues, but that's also why NATO allies have been so clear that we are there to support Ukraine.
When we talk about the situation on the ground in Russian Federation, the first thing that you pay attention to is, for example, this drones attack over Kremlin. What do you make of it? I mean, how do you evaluate that? Who, in your opinion, is responsible for the situation, and what conclusions do you make?
So I'm not able to comment on that specific instance. What we know is that President Putin has made many false claims about what's going on, both in Russia and in Ukraine. We also see that his aggressive actions abroad has taken place in parallel with more and more oppressive, repressive behavior at home, cracking down on independent media, on opposition, and therefore it's harder and harder to understand and to verify exactly what's going on in Russia, because we have seen so many false claims from the Kremlin, and we don't have the independent critical media that can dig into and find out exactly what happened. What I can say is that the best way of end all of this is for President Putin to end the war. He started the war. He can end the war today. If President Putin stops sending soldiers to Ukraine, then we will have peace. And Russia will be safe because there is no military threat against Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance. If President Zelensky and Ukrainians stops fighting, then Ukraine will cease to exist as a sovereign, independent nation. So this is a war aggression, and there's one aggressor, and that's President Putin and the Kremlin, and they have a responsibility to stop the war, which will also be in the interest of Russia. So therefore, I strongly urge President Putin to really stop this senseless war.
In contrary of thinking about the finishing this war and stopping this terrible actions on the ground in Ukraine, he threatens NATO and Ukraine and the whole world with the nuclear weapons. Do you think he's bluffing, or this is serious?
What we have seen from Russia is reckless nuclear rhetoric for several months, actually before the war, but even more so during the war. President Putin knows that any use of nuclear weapons will totally change the nature of the conflict. He also knows that a nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. We are closely monitoring, of course, from the NATO side, what Russia does. And so far we haven't seen any changes in the Russian nuclear posture that requires any changes in our posture. What we also see is that this nuclear rhetoric is an attempt by Kremlin to coerce NATO allies to prevent us from supporting Ukraine. But that will be extremely dangerous, because if we accept this kind of coercion, this kind of threats, then of course aggressive behavior, the use of force, will always pay off for nuclear power as Russia. NATO and NATO allies are not party to the conflict, but we support Ukraine, and Ukraine has the right to defend itself. The right of self-defense is enshrined in the UN Charter, and we are helping Ukraine to uphold that right of self-defense.
Just one additional question, if you don't mind, Secretary General. It's about Ukraine's NATO membership. You know how deeply Ukrainians believe in this membership and the prospects of membership. So I know and understand that you do not make any prognosis on the timing about that, but still, you have mentioned Vilnius summit. Is there a possibility that Ukraine gets at least membership action plan?
All allies agree that Ukraine will become a member of NATO. All allies agree that NATO's door should remain open, and all allies agree that it's not for Moscow to decide who can become a NATO ally or not. It's for Ukraine and the 31 members of the alliance. Then I'm not able to give you any timetable, but what I can tell you is that all NATO allies agree, and also I'm also confident that will also be clearly expressed at the Vilnius summit, that the most urgent, the most immediate task now is to ensure that President Putin does not win in Ukraine, that Ukraine prevails as a sovereign, independent nation in Europe, because unless that happens, there is no membership issue to be discussed at all. And therefore, yes, we need to address what happens after the war. Yes, we need to ensure that we put in place frameworks, support for Ukraine, that prevent Russia from continuing this pattern of aggressive behavior, starting in 2014, annexing Crimea, going into Eastern Donbass, and then the full-fledged invasion last year. And there are consultations going on among NATO allies, but the most important message now is to provide military support to Ukraine so they prevail as a sovereign, independent nation.
So obviously, before the war is finished, Ukraine is not likely to get the membership action plan.
Well, what we have stated in the different decisions we have taken on this is that Ukraine will become a member, and that next step towards membership is a membership action plan. But again, I'm not in a position where I can give you any exact timetables. What I can say is that all allies agree that they will become a member, but all allies also agree that we need to solve the urgent, immediate, extremely critical task of providing heavy, unprecedented military support to Ukraine to ensure that Ukraine prevails. Because unless Ukraine prevails as a sovereign state, there is no membership issue to discuss, neither in the short term or in the long term, because of course it's a democratic sovereign Ukraine that can become a NATO ally.
Yeah, I just think about the Bucharest summit in 2008, April. I was there covering the summit. I remember that Georgia and Ukraine, as you perfectly know, were denied this membership action plan. I'm sure that you've thought about that a lot. Do you think that if they got this map, there would not be the wars in Georgia and Ukraine?
So I have thought about that because I was also in Bucharest in 2008, then as Norwegian Prime Minister, and of course I remember the negotiations, the consultations, and of course it's never easy when you have many allies that have to agree on sensitive and difficult issues. We reached a conclusion. And since then we have also provided support to Ukraine in different forms and formats, especially since 2014, where NATO allies have provided training and NATO has provided also help and support to Ukraine. And it's a very hypothetical discussion. I think what is important to understand is that regardless of what you think about that hypothetical situation, if there had been a membership action plan, would things have developed different? Nobody knows. But what we do know is that President Putin's war against Ukraine is illegal. It's a blatant violation of international law, and a membership action plan or not doesn't provide any excuse for Moscow to attack another country. So of course we can have interesting discussions about hypothetical situations in the past, but they don't change at all the main issue in question now, and that is that Putin has decided to use brutal military force against another country, which has led to a lot of suffering, war crimes, rapes, forceful abduction of children, killing of civilians, and thousands of casualties, also among Russians, soldiers who have been used as cannon fodder at the front line. So yes, I accept that you asked a question, but no, it has actually no impact on what we have to decide today, and that is to stand up against these aggressive policies of Moscow, of President Putin, which leads to suffering in Ukraine, but also which means that Russians, ordinary Russians, have to pay a very high price for this senseless war.
So true. Thank you very much. I really appreciate the opportunity. Hope to see you again soon on TV Rain.
Thank you so much.
We operated in Russia for 12 years, and the government tried to get rid of us 3 times.
We had to leave, forced out of the country by new repressive laws after the first week of the war. Our freedom crushed by the authorities.
Мы временно приостанавливаем работу телеканала.
We survived, started working from Europe, and now we are watched by millions of people every day.
There's no other independent news channel in Russian. We have now decided to tell the truth about Russia in English as well.
So that you could get news about Russia, the war in Ukraine, and Russian society directly from the source.
We want to tell you firsthand what is really happening in Russia. Subscribe to TV Rain Newsroom on YouTube, and let's take a look at our future together.